Welcome to our channel. Before we get started, please consider liking and subscribing so we can bring more stories like this to you.
The Garden of Giving. The morning sun, a painter with a golden brush, stroked the dew-kissed leaves of Agnes Moreau's tomato plants. The air hung thick and sweet, a fragrant cocktail of ripening peaches, blooming lavender, and the earthy aroma of freshly turned soil. Agnes, her hands gnarled with age and stained a permanent green, hummed a tuneless melody as she pruned a sprawling zucchini vine. Children's laughter, bright and effervescent, drifted from the far corner of the garden. A gaggle of them, ranging in age from maybe 6 to 10, were carefully picking strawberries, their small fingers stained crimson. Agnes watched them with a warm smile that crinkled the corners of her eyes. They were from the after-school program at the community center, a lifeline for families struggling to make ends meet. Remember, only the red ones. Agnes called out, her voice a little raspy but full of affection, and leave some for the birds. Little Maria, a girl with braids the color of midnight, skipped over to Agnes, her basket overflowing. Mrs. Moreau, these are the sweetest strawberries I've ever tasted. My little brother is going to love them. Agnes beamed. That's what makes it all worthwhile, sweetheart. That's what it's all about. She gently patted Maria's head. Now, run along and help the others. Mr. Johnson will be here soon to take you all back. As Maria scampered back to the strawberry patch, Agnes's gaze lingered on the children. They were a constant reminder of why she poured her heart and soul into this garden. It wasn't just a hobby, it was a mission, a legacy she and her late husband, George, had built together. She remembered George, his booming laugh and gentle hands, the way he could coax life out of even the most barren soil. He had been the dreamer, envisioning a garden that would feed not just their family, but the entire community. She had been the pragmatist, the one who figured out the logistics, the best way to plant, the most efficient way to harvest. Together, they had created this haven, this garden of giving. A robin landed on the handle of her spade, cocking its head as if in greeting. "Hello there, Georgie," Agnes murmured, a wistful smile gracing her lips. "Missing your strawberries, are you?" She tossed a handful of overripe berries towards the bird, a silent conversation passing between them. It had been 5 years since George had passed, and the garden, in many ways, was the only place she truly felt connected to him. The midday sun beat down, and Agnes wiped a bead of sweat from her brow. She straightened up, feeling a twinge in her back, a familiar ache that she stubbornly ignored. There were still peaches to pick, beans to string, and rows of lettuce to water. Her small, weather-beaten house, a simple bungalow painted a cheerful yellow, stood at the edge of the garden. Inside, the furniture was old and worn, but the rooms were filled with light and the comforting scent of cinnamon and dried herbs. Agnes didn't need much. She had her garden, her memories, and the satisfaction of knowing she was making a difference. Later that afternoon, as Agnes was sorting through a basket of ripe tomatoes, Mrs. Rodriguez from the community center arrived. "Agnes, you're a lifesaver," she said, her voice filled with gratitude. "We were running low on supplies, and these tomatoes are just what we needed for tonight's dinner." Agnes brushed off the compliment. "It's my pleasure, Maria. That's what gardens are for, isn't it, to share the bounty?" Mrs. Rodriguez hesitated for a moment, then spoke softly. "Agnes, I heard about the lawsuit. That woman, Mrs. Davison, suing you. How are you holding up?" Agnes's smile faltered, but she quickly recovered. "Oh, it's just a little bump in the road, Maria. I won't let it stop me from doing what I need to do." She picked up a particularly plump tomato and held it out. "Here, Maria, take this one. It's the best of the bunch." Mrs. Rodriguez accepted the tomato, her eyes filled with concern. "Agnes, you shouldn't have to deal with this. You're a treasure to this community." Agnes waved her hand dismissively. "Don't you worry about me, Maria. I'm a tough old bird, and besides," she added with a twinkle in her eye, "I have a whole army of little strawberry pickers on my side." But as Mrs. Rodriguez left, Agnes's smile faded. The lawsuit weighed on her, a persistent worry that gnawed at the edges of her peace. The garden was more than just a garden. It was her legacy, her connection to George, her gift to the children, and the thought of losing it, of letting Mrs. Davison take it all away, filled her with a quiet, simmering dread. She looked out over her vibrant, bountiful garden, and a fierce determination hardened her gaze. She wouldn't give up without a fight. The children were depending on her, and George would expect nothing less. The HOA's eye. At precisely 6 o'clock, The atomic clock's chime roused Karen Billings. Precision wasn't just a preference, it was the cornerstone of her equilibrium, and by extension, the perceived stability of Willow Creek Estates. Throwing back sheets of meticulously chosen Egyptian cotton, she walked to the window. The dawn, sieved through carefully adjusted blinds, fell upon her lawn. A vibrant expanse of uniformly upright blades, nourished by her custom-blended fertilizer, concocted from a rutgers university agricultural study. Not a solitary dandelion dared poke through. A fleeting smile touched her lips. This was system, this was dominion. Downstairs, the aroma of freshly ground Sumatran mandheling filled her impeccably arranged kitchen. As she brewed, a pot labeled spices lined the shelves, utensils nestled in their designated slots. A misplaced spoon, she believed, was the genesis of disorder. Later, clad in a sharply tailored blazer and flawlessly creased chinos, Karen piloted her Lexus through Willow Creek's manicured lanes. Her gaze swept across lawns, mailboxes, the alignment of refuse containers on collection day. No minor infraction escaped her scrutiny. An ever so slightly overgrown hedge. A faded doormat. An errant basketball hoop. Each deviation was logged in her mental register, ready to be dissected at the upcoming HOA assembly. The monthly convocation convened in the community clubhouse, a beige structure Karen deemed functionally adequate, if aesthetically uninspired. The atmosphere hung heavy with stale coffee and unspoken resentments. "Morning, Karen," drawled Harold Peterson, the HOA president, a perpetually flustered retired accountant. "Harold," Karen responded, her tone efficient. "Let's proceed. I have concerns regarding property values." She launched into her prepared presentation, armed with statistics from Zillow and Redfin, drawing a distinct link between curb appeal and market worth. "Vigilance is paramount," she declared, her eyes roving the room, pausing pointedly on Mrs. Gable, whose petunias were undeniably past their prime. "A single blemish can devalue the entire community." A murmur of acknowledgement rippled through the gathering. Karen reveled in it, the sensation of command, the reinforcement of her concerns. It was a bulwark against the subtle anxieties that gnawed at her in the stillness of night, the fear that she, too, might be somehow inadequate. Returning home post-meeting, Karen spotted something that tightened her grip on the wheel. On Sycamore Lane, a street she typically avoided, considering it too unsophisticated, stood Agnes's house. Agnes, the gentle, widowed neighbor, forever enveloped in a faint lavender scent and an air of vagueness, and Agnes's garden. It defied the very definition of garden. It was an explosion. Tomato plants scaled haphazardly up supports fashioned from what appeared to be repurposed bed frames. Zucchini vines sprawled, threatening to consume the mailbox. Peppers, a kaleidoscope of hues, blazed in the afternoon light. Corn stalks, towering giants, swayed in the breeze. Karen pulled over, the crunch of gravel beneath her impeccably maintained shoes. She gaped, horrified. This was anarchy. This was a flagrant violation of Willow Creek Estate's painstakingly cultivated facade. She extracted her phone and consulted the HOA bylaws. Section 3, Subsection B, Landscaping Regulations. All plant life must be contained within designated flowerbeds or planters. Height restrictions apply. Aesthetic uniformity is mandatory. She recited it, her voice a blend of outrage and something else. A sort of morbid intrigue. Agnes's garden flouted nearly every regulation. Karen meticulously documented the scene, zooming in on each individual breach: the unruly zucchini, the wayward tomato, the suspiciously towering corn. She dictated a detailed memo, couching each infraction in precise legal language. As she departed, a seed of resolve had taken root. This could not endure. Agnes's garden represented a threat, not just to property values, but to the very essence of Willow Creek Estates. She would confront it, she would enforce the standards, she would reinstate order, and perhaps, just perhaps, she would finally quell those murmuring insecurities, if only momentarily. Warning signs. Karen tapped her pen against the pristine surface of her desk, the rhythmic click echoing in the otherwise silent office outside. The perfectly manicured lawn of her suburban home stretched towards the horizon, a testament to order and control. But inside, a simmering unease threatened to disrupt her carefully constructed peace. It was Agnes Moreau's garden again. She swiveled her chair towards the computer, the screen illuminating her face with a cool, blue light. The document already open bore the sterile title, Notice of Violation. She reread the first paragraph, the carefully chosen words a shield against any potential accusations of malice. It focused solely on the facts: overgrown vegetation, unapproved structures, the whimsical scarecrows, the repurposed bird bath, and a general aesthetic incongruent with the community guidelines. With a tight sigh, she added another line, this one a little sharper. Failure to rectify these violations within 14 days will result in further action, as outlined in the HOA bylaws. She printed the letter, the machine whirring its mechanical judgment. The crisp paper felt surprisingly heavy in her hand. This wasn't personal, she reminded herself. It was about maintaining standards, protecting property values. Yet, a nagging voice whispered that there was more to it than that. 3 days later, Agnes found the letter tucked between the ceramic robin and the terracotta pot on her porch. The robin seemed to tilt its head inquisitively at the official-looking envelope. Agnes, her hand stained with earth and smelling of thyme, carefully opened it. The word swam before her eyes, the formal language a foreign tongue. Vegetation. Violation. Aesthetic incongruity. She sat heavily on the porch swing, the rusty springs groaning in protest. Her garden, a vibrant tapestry of tomatoes, peppers, and sunflowers, a haven for buzzing bees and chirping birds, a source of nourishment for the children at the local shelter. Violation. The thought stung more than a bee sting. That evening, with arthritic fingers, she painstakingly penned a reply. She wrote of the joy the garden brought to the community, of the fresh produce she donated, of the lessons she taught the children about nature and sustainability. She described the heirloom tomatoes she'd cultivated from seeds passed down through generations, the beans her grandmother had grown during the Depression. She wrote of life and hope and the simple beauty of watching things grow. The letter was heartfelt, a plea from the soil itself. Karen read Agnes's letter with a growing sense of irritation. Sentimentality, she thought, was a dangerous thing. It clouded judgment, excused negligence. The letter reeked of the historical significance of moldy tomatoes was irrelevant. The needs of underprivileged children were a separate issue. The garden remained an eyesore, a blatant disregard for the rules. She deleted the email without responding. Instead, she drafted another letter, this one shorter, more direct. The tone was no longer polite, it was firm, bordering on threatening. Your response is insufficient. The violations remain unaddressed. You have 7 days to comply with the HOA regulations. Failure to do so will result in a formal complaint and the commencement of legal proceedings. This is your final warning. This time, she didn't hesitate. She didn't question her motives. She felt a surge of cold satisfaction, a sense of control regained. She imagined Agnes reading the letter, her face crumpling with defeat. Maybe, just maybe, this would finally bring order to the unruly chaos that was Agnes Moreau's garden, and perhaps, she dared to hope, it would finally silence that nagging voice inside her head. The lawsuit. Karen smoothed the already pristine fabric of her skirt as she sat in the plush leather chair of the lawyer. A man whose smile seemed permanently etched on his face steepled his fingers. So, Mrs. Billings, to reiterate, the goal is to compel Mrs. Moreau to comply with the HOA regulations regarding acceptable landscaping. Precisely, Karen affirmed, her voice tight with suppressed frustration. It's a blight. A visual assault on the neighborhood. My property values are at stake, Mr. Abernathy, and frankly, it's the principle of the thing. Rules are rules. Abernathy nodded, his smile widening slightly. Of course. We will argue that her non-compliance constitutes a nuisance, potentially impacting property values, as you said, and violating the covenants clearly outlined in the HOA agreement. We'll seek an injunction, compelling her to remove the offending vegetation. Karen felt a surge of satisfaction. Finally, action, finally, someone taking her concerns seriously. And the costs, I expect her to cover all legal fees. Abernathy chuckled, a low, rumbling sound. We'll certainly pursue that. It's often a strong deterrent. I'll have the paperwork drafted by the end of the week. Karen left his office feeling a sense of purpose she hadn't experienced in weeks. The world was chaotic, unpredictable, but here, in this small corner, she could restore order. The lawsuit arrived on a Tuesday morning. Agnes was deadheading her tomato plants, the sweet, earthy scent clinging to her fingers. A young man in a crisp uniform handed her a thick manila envelope. Agnes Moreau, he asked, his voice devoid of warmth. You've been served. The words echoed in her head as she watched him walk away. Served. Like a criminal with trembling hands, she tore open the envelope. The legal jargon swam before her eyes, a confusing jumble of accusations and demands. The words injunction, nuisance, and property devaluation jumped out, each a little barb twisting deeper into her heart. She sank onto her porch swing, the lawsuit papers fluttering to the floor. Her vision blurred. This couldn't be happening. All she wanted was to share the bounty of her garden, to help those in need now. She was being threatened, attacked for hours. She sat there, numb. As dusk settled, painting the sky in shades of bruised purple and orange, she finally stirred. She needed help, but who could she turn to? The next day was a blur of phone calls. Legal aid societies were overburdened, their lines constantly busy. Private attorneys quoted exorbitant fees, amounts that represented months of her meager Social Security income. "I just don't have that kind of money," she pleaded with one lawyer, her voice cracking. "Isn't there anyone who could help me pro bono?" The lawyer sighed audibly. "Unfortunately, Mrs. Moreau, we're a business. Pro bono work is limited, and frankly, HOA disputes, they're rarely worth the effort." Agnes hung up, the weight of despair pressing down on her. She looked out at her garden, the vibrant colors mocking her. The peppers gleamed like jewels, the tomatoes ripened under the sun, the herbs released their fragrant oils. All this beauty, all this generosity, threatened by a piece of paper. She walked out to the edge of her property, where the meticulously manicured lawn of Karen Billings stretched out like a green carpet. She could see Karen inside, silhouetted against the living room window, moving with an air of brisk efficiency. Agnes took a deep breath, gathering her courage. She walked across the lawn, the cool grass damp beneath her bare feet. She reached Karen's front door and knocked. Karen opened the door, her expression a mask of cool disapproval. "Mrs. Moreau," she said, her voice clipped. "I thought I made my feelings clear." "Karen," Agnes said, her voice trembling slightly. "Please, can we talk? This lawsuit, it's all a misunderstanding. I'm not trying to cause trouble. I just want to help people." Karen crossed her arms. "By violating the HOA regulations, by creating an eyesore that lowers property values, I'm afraid there's nothing to discuss. The matter is now in the hands of my lawyer." Agnes's shoulders slumped. "But the children, the food bank, they depend on this garden." Karen's face remained unmoved. "Perhaps you should have considered that before you decided to disregard the rules. Good day, Mrs. Moreau." The door closed softly, but the sound echoed in Agnes's ears like a thunderclap. She stood there for a moment, defeated, the weight of the lawsuit crushing her spirit. As she walked back to her garden, a single tear traced a path down her weathered cheek. She felt utterly alone, facing a battle she didn't know how to fight. A reporter's curiosity, the clatter of ceramic mugs, and the low hum of conversation were a familiar comfort to Sarah. The Daily Gazette wasn't exactly rolling in dough, but at least it afforded her the occasional latte from Been There, Brewed That, the only decent coffee shop within a 5-mile radius of the office. Today, however, the comforting sounds were almost enough to drown out the snippet of conversation that snagged her attention. "Absolutely ridiculous, suing her over a garden. Agnes is a saint." Sarah lowered her newspaper, subtly angling herself to better eavesdrop. 2 women, probably in their late 40s, were animatedly discussing something over their pastries. "And for what?" "Aesthetic violations. I swear, that HOA is out of control. Poor Agnes, she doesn't deserve this." "I heard it's that Karen Henderson leading the charge, you know, the one with the perfectly manicured lawn and the asterisk everything asterisk." Sarah's reporter instincts tingled. HOAs and petty squabbles were a dime a dozen, but the vehemence in their voices, the palpable sense of injustice. That was different. "Excuse me," she interjected, flashing her most disarming smile. "I couldn't help but overhear. Are you talking about the lawsuit against Agnes Miller?" The women, momentarily startled, nodded. "You know about it?" one asked, her brow furrowed. "I'm Sarah, from the Daily Gazette. I hadn't heard anything about it, but, well, your conversation piqued my interest." They introduced themselves as Carol and Diane, both residents of the Willow Creek Estates HOA. They readily filled her in, their indignation bubbling over with each sentence. They described Agnes' vibrant garden, overflowing with tomatoes, squash, and peppers, all freely given to the local food bank and families in need. They painted a picture of Karen Henderson as a tyrannical HOA president, obsessed with uniformity and seemingly devoid of compassion. By the time Sarah finished her latte, she had the outline of a story brewing in her mind, one that resonated with the kind of human interest pieces she excelled at. Back at her desk, she fired up her computer. First, Agnes Miller. A quick search revealed a few community service awards and a glowing profile in a local gardening magazine a few years back. The article highlighted Agnes' dedication to sustainable gardening and her passion for feeding the hungry. Then, Karen Henderson. Her online presence was curated, perfect family photos, meticulously staged holidays, volunteer work for the right charities. Sarah dug deeper, sifting through property records and HOA meeting minutes. Karen had indeed been a vocal advocate for stricter landscaping regulations for months, citing property value concerns and community aesthetics. The contrast was stark. Agnes, the selfless gardener, versus Karen, the seemingly heartless HOA president. But Sarah knew better than to jump to conclusions. There were always two sides to every story, and often, a lot of grey in between. The next morning, Sarah found herself driving towards Willow Creek Estates. The houses were uniformly beige, each lawn a meticulously trimmed carpet of green. Agnes' house, however, stood out. Even from the street, Sarah could see the riot of colour spilling over the edges of her garden. Tomatoes ripened on the vine, sunflowers towered over the fence, and the air hummed with the buzzing of bees. Taking a deep breath, Sarah walked up to the front door and knocked. A moment later, Agnes opened it, her face etched with worry lines. "Yes?" she asked, her voice soft but firm. "Mrs. Miller, my name is Sarah, and I'm a reporter with the Daily Gazette. I was hoping I could talk to you about the lawsuit." Agnes' shoulders slumped. "I suppose it was only a matter of time," she sighed, stepping back to allow Sarah inside. "Come, let's sit in the garden. It's the only place I feel any peace these days." As Sarah followed Agnes into the vibrant chaos of her garden, she knew that this was more than just a story about an HOA dispute. This was a story about community, about compassion, and about the battle between conformity and individuality, and Sarah was determined to tell it right. The power of the press. The scent of ripe tomatoes hung heavy in the air, a sweet, earthy perfume that mingled with the sharp tang of basil. Sarah knelt beside Agnes, the damp earth staining her jeans. Agnes's small, gnarled hands, stained green from her labor, trembled as she pointed to a row of vibrant purple eggplants. "These," Agnes said, her voice thick with emotion, "these are for the children at the shelter. They haven't tasted anything this fresh, this alive, in months. Karen wants to take that away." A tear tracked a clean path down her weathered cheek, cutting through the dust. "I don't understand. What harm am I doing?" Sarah listened intently, the weight of Agnes's quiet desperation pressing down on her. She scribbled furiously in her notepad, capturing not just the words, but the tremor in Agnes's voice, the way the sun glinted off the silver in her hair, the sheer, defiant love in her eyes as she surveyed her garden. The garden, a chaotic explosion of color and life, was a testament to Agnes's spirit. A tangible manifestation of her kindness. It was more than just vegetables, it was hope, nurtured and grown. From the earth, back in her cramped apartment, Sarah felt the familiar thrill of purpose surge through her. The story demanded to be told, not just as a dry recounting of legal proceedings, but as a human drama, a David and Goliath battle played out in a suburban garden. She stared at the blank screen, searching for the right words, the phrases that would resonate with readers and expose the raw injustice of the situation. She typed, slowly at first, then with increasing speed, the words flowing from her fingertips like water released from a dam. She described Agnes's unwavering dedication to feeding underprivileged children, the meticulous care she lavished on her garden, the heartbreaking fear that permeated her voice when she spoke of losing it all. She painted a vivid picture of the garden itself, the vibrant colors, the buzzing bees, the sense of abundance and life. Then she turned her attention to Karen. She avoided sensationalizing, choosing instead to present the facts, the HOA bylaws, the escalating demands, the lawsuit that threatened to bankrupt Agnes. She included excerpts from Karen's emails, letting her own words speak for themselves, revealing the cold, impersonal nature of her actions. Sarah worked late into the night, fueled by coffee and a burning desire to do justice to Agnes's story. Finally, as the first rays of dawn crept through her window, she reread the article, tweaking, refining, until she was satisfied that it captured the essence of the situation. It wasn't just a story about a lawsuit, it was a story about community, compassion, and the right to cultivate beauty in a world that often felt harsh and unforgiving. The headline screamed from the front page of the local paper, "Elderly Gardener Faces Lawsuit for Feeding the Needy." The accompanying photo, a close-up of Agnes's face, etched with worry but illuminated by an unwavering spirit, was impossible to ignore. Within hours, the article went viral. Social media exploded with outrage. #Stand with Agnes became a trending topic. News outlets picked up the story, amplifying Agnes's plight to a national audience. Comment sections overflowed with messages of support, condemning Karen's actions and praising Agnes's selfless dedication. Donations poured in, exceeding Agnes's wildest dreams lawyers offered their services pro bono, volunteers flocked to her garden, weeding, planting, and harvesting. The community rallied around Agnes, transforming her small plot of land into a symbol of resistance against petty tyranny and a celebration of human kindness. Sarah watched the unfolding events with a mixture of awe and satisfaction. She had simply told the story, but the story itself had possessed the power to ignite a firestorm of public opinion. The power of the press, she realized, wasn't just in reporting the news, but in shaping the narrative, in giving voice to the voiceless, and in holding the powerful accountable. She hoped, with every fiber of her being, that it would be enough to save Agnes's garden and, more importantly, to restore her faith in humanity. Facing the music, the laptop screen burned like a brand against her eyes. Karen scanned the virulent commentary, each line a fresh jab to her gut. Selfish shrew. Cold-blooded tyrant. Destroying everything for her own ego. The digital mob had convened, and she was the target. Escaping to Facebook offered no sanctuary, only a magnified reflection of the same hate. A meme juxtaposed her image with a scowling cartoon villain, posing the question, who stole Willow Creek's summer joy? The share count spiraled into the stratosphere. Her phone vibrated, a frantic tattoo against the desk, each ping a spike in her anxiety. The majority were anonymous, weaving a tapestry of veiled threats and blatant insults. A few, sharper still, came from people she knew, their messages laced with brittle disappointment. Even her sister, usually her rock, offered only a clipped, "Karen, explain yourself." The laptop slammed shut, the sudden quiet of her meticulously curated living room offering no solace. Instead, the silence amplified the frantic drumbeat in her skull. This wasn't how it was supposed to unfold. She was simply enforcing the covenant, safeguarding property values, shielding the community from a rogue tomato plant. The doorbell chimed, a shrill intrusion, peeking through the peephole. Karen saw a delegation of neighbors massed on her porch, their expressions a blend of resentment and hurt. Mrs. Henderson, whose roses Karen secretly envied, stood at their vanguard. An icy dread constricted Karen's chest. She considered feigning absence, hoping they'd disperse, but she knew such avoidance would only fan the flames. The door opened a hesitant inch. Yes. Mrs. Henderson stepped forward, her voice tight. "Karen, we need to discuss Mr. Peterson about what you've initiated." A chorus of voices rose behind her. "He's an institution. His garden feeds those in need. You're wrecking his life." Defensiveness flared. "He's violating the regulations. What about our property values? The rules exist for a reason." Her voice, betraying her inner turmoil, quivered slightly. Mr. Abernathy, the retired lawyer from across the street, spoke with a lawyerly calm. "Karen, property values aren't the measure of everything. Sometimes, community trumps perfectly pruned hedges. You're causing pain to a kind man and fracturing this neighborhood." He brandished a newspaper featuring a photo of Mr. Peterson surrounded by beaming children, their arms laden with vegetables. The headline blared, "Willow Creek's benevolent gardener faces legal jeopardy." The faces swam before her eyes. Karen shoved the door shut, the reverberation echoing through the house like a gunshot. She sagged against the cool wood, her breath catching in ragged gasps. The weight of their disapproval felt like a physical burden, pressing down on her. Later, an urgent email from the HOA president landed in her inbox. An emergency session was scheduled for 8 p.m. Karen knew its purpose. The meeting room felt airless, charged with silent condemnation. The board members, typically obsequious, averted their gazes. Even Bob, usually her unwavering echo, seemed ill at ease. "Karen," the president began, his tone strained, "we've convened this meeting to address the situation at hand." He indicated a mountain of newspapers and printouts littering the table. "The adverse publicity is substantial. Property values are already showing signs of impact. We've been deluged with complaints. Residents are threatening to default on their dues." Another board member, Susan, her voice a mere whisper, ventured, "Karen, we appreciate your concern for upholding standards, but perhaps there's room for some leeway. Mr. Peterson's garden, it's doing such invaluable work." "Leeway?" Karen's voice sharpened. "He's in direct violation. It sets a dangerous precedent." The president sighed, the sound heavy with resignation. "Karen, we implore you to reconsider the lawsuit for the sake of the community, for your own well-being." He paused, his expression hardening. "While you retain the right to proceed, we believe it is no longer in Willow Creek's best interest." Her gaze swept the room, searching for a glimmer of support, a trace of understanding, she saw only disappointment and condemnation. The music had ceased, leaving her exposed and vulnerable beneath the harsh spotlight. The weight of the community's judgment, the ramifications of her actions, threatened to crush the air from her lungs. A change of heart. The silence in her meticulously organized living room was deafening. Karen stared at the framed photo on the mantelpiece, a younger, softer Karen, arm in arm with her late husband, David, at their wedding. David, who'd always championed the underdog, who'd gently teased her about her rigid adherence to rules. "Loosen the reins a little, Karen," he'd often said, his eyes twinkling. "Life's too short to sweat the small stuff." The small stuff, was that what she'd been doing, sweating the small stuff while the big things, the truly important things, slipped away? The media frenzy had died down, but the whispers hadn't. They followed her to the grocery store, echoed in the vacant stares of her neighbors. She'd become a pariah, a cautionary tale, and for what? For enforcing a regulation that, in the grand scheme of things, was utterly meaningless. She thought of Agnes Moreau, her face etched with worry, her voice trembling as she spoke of the children she fed. Karen had dismissed it as sentimentality, a blatant attempt to manipulate her, but now, the memory stung. She saw not manipulation, but genuine compassion, a selfless act she had actively tried to dismantle. A wave of nausea rolled over her. She hadn't eaten a proper meal in days, sleep offered no respite, only fragmented images of withered plants and accusing eyes. The pristine order she craved, the perfect lawn, the unblemished facade of her life, it all felt hollow, a gilded cage of her own making. She walked into the kitchen, the gleaming stainless steel mocking her emptiness. She poured herself a glass of water, her hand shaking so violently she nearly dropped the glass. This wasn't her. She wasn't a monster. She was lost. The realization hit her with the force of a physical blow. She had allowed fear of declining property values, fear of chaos, fear of anything that disrupted her carefully constructed world, to dictate her actions. She'd clung to the rules as a lifeline, mistaking control for security. A single, desperate thought took root. She had to fix this. She had to try. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across Agnes's garden as Karen approached. The air was thick with the scent of ripe tomatoes and blooming basil. Agnes was there, kneeling by a row of zucchini plants, her hands caked with dirt. Karen hesitated at the gate, her heart pounding in her chest. This was it. There was no turning back. She pushed the gate open and stepped inside. Agnes looked up, her expression guarded. "Mrs. Billings," she said, her voice flat. Karen swallowed hard. "Agnes," she began, her voice cracking. I came to apologize." Agnes didn't respond, her gaze unwavering. "I was wrong," Karen continued, tears welling in her eyes. "So terribly wrong. I let my fear get the better of me. I didn't see the good you were doing, the lives you were touching." She choked on a sob. "I caused you so much pain, and I am truly, deeply sorry." She reached out a hand, then quickly withdrew it, unsure if she deserved to touch Agnes. "I've dropped the lawsuit. I understand if you can't forgive me, but I had to tell you. I had to try." Agnes watched her for a long moment, her face unreadable. Then, slowly, a flicker of something akin to understanding crossed her features. She rose to her feet, her movement stiff with age. "It takes courage to admit when you're wrong, Karen," she said, her voice softening. "More courage than most people possess." Karen wiped the tears from her face with the back of her hand. "I don't deserve your kindness." Agnes stepped closer, her eyes filled with a gentle compassion. "We all make mistakes, child. It's what we do after that defines us." She reached out and took Karen's hand in hers, her grip surprisingly strong. "I forgive you, Karen, truly, I do." A fresh wave of tears streamed down Karen's face. She squeezed Agnes's hand, a silent thank you. In that moment, surrounded by the fragrant earth and the bounty of Agnes's garden, Karen felt a glimmer of hope, a fragile seed of redemption taking root within her. Maybe, just maybe, she could find her way back to being the person David believed she could be. Seeds of friendship. The town hall meeting felt less like a civic duty and more like a public execution of her. Karen swallowed, the dryness in her throat a stark contrast to the sweat slicking her palms. She'd rehearsed her statement 100 times, but the weight of 100 pairs of eyes still threatened to crush her. Agnes sat in the front row, her gaze steady, unwavering. There was no triumph there, only a quiet dignity that made Karen feel even smaller. It was a look that dared her to do the right thing, not for herself, but for everyone else. Taking a deep breath, Karen stepped up to the microphone. The amplified click echoed in the suddenly silent room. "Good evening," she began, her voice wavering only slightly. I wanted to address the lawsuit I filed against Ms. Moreau." She paused, the weight of her words pressing down on her. "After much reflection, and after seeing the outpouring of support for Ms. Moreau and her garden, I have decided to drop the lawsuit, effective immediately." A collective gasp rippled through the room, followed by a low murmur of disbelief. Karen held up a hand, silencing the crowd. "Furthermore," she continued, her voice gaining strength, "I plan to volunteer my time to help Ms. Moreau maintain and expand the garden. I believe it's a valuable asset to our community, especially for the children it serves." The silence that followed was profound, broken only by the rustling of clothes as people shifted in their seats. Then, a slow clap began, hesitant at first, but quickly growing into a thunderous applause. Karen looked at Agnes, who offered a small, almost imperceptible nod. The next morning dawned bright and clear, washing the town in a warm, golden light. Karen, dressed in old jeans and a t-shirt, clothes she hadn't worn in years, stood awkwardly at the edge of Agnes's garden. The soil smelled rich and earthy, a far cry from the manicured lawns she was used to. Agnes approached, a trowel in one hand and a pair of gardening gloves in the other. "Welcome, Karen," she said, her voice surprisingly gentle. "Ready to get your hands dirty?" Karen managed a weak smile. "As I'll ever be." Agnes handed her the gloves. "We'll start with these tomato seedlings. They need to be transplanted into larger pots." Working side by side, they fell into an easy rhythm. Agnes patiently showed Karen how to gently loosen the seedlings from their trays, how to create a small well in the new pot, how to carefully cover the roots with soil. The sun beat down on their backs, the only sounds the chirping of birds and the soft clinking of tools. Karen, who had always considered gardening a frivolous waste of time, found herself strangely absorbed in the task. There was something deeply satisfying about nurturing life. About coaxing something beautiful and useful from the earth. She felt a sense of accomplishment she hadn't experienced in years. As the weeks passed, the garden flourished. Karen and Agnes planted rows of zucchini, peppers, and beans. They added a colorful patch of sunflowers and zinnias, attracting buzzing bees and fluttering butterflies. The community rallied around them, donating seeds, tools, and their time. Children from the nearby elementary school came to help water and weed, their laughter echoing through the garden. One afternoon, as they were harvesting a bumper crop of tomatoes, Karen turned to Agnes. "I never understood," she said, her voice soft. "I was so focused on rules and appearances that I completely missed the point." Agnes smiled, her eyes crinkling at the corners. "Sometimes," she said, "we need to see the world through different eyes to truly understand it." They sat on a weathered bench, overlooking the garden. The setting sun painted the sky in hues of orange and pink. "I've been thinking," Agnes began, "about the future of the garden. I'm not getting any younger, you know." Karen nodded. "We could create a foundation," she suggested. "Ensure that the garden continues to benefit underprivileged children for years to come. We can set up a board of directors, secure funding, maybe even expand the program." Agnes beamed. "That's a wonderful idea, Karen. A legacy, planted in the soil and nurtured by the community." She paused, her gaze sweeping over the vibrant garden. "Seeds of friendship, indeed." Karen smiled, a genuine smile that reached her eyes. The garden had not only transformed the community, but it had also transformed her. She had come seeking order, but she had found something far more valuable: connection, purpose, and an unlikely friendship, blossoming amidst the vegetables and flowers.